I can ask you a quick question.
Okay.
From Tone R. So do you experience more banding after grading with CineStyle versus neutral?
No, they're almost the same. The CineStyle pretty much just drops the saturation, but they're pretty much almost identical in the way that they work. It's just a little less saturated, and when you go through grading, it's just a lot easier to deal with.
Incidentally, we obviously, the amount of material we've shot on house, we have had banding problems sometimes, and the worst situations are where you're photographing very large areas of very slightly graduated sort of areas. For example, a sky that goes very smoothly from, say, a very pale blue to a darker blue over a very large area. And I think the blue channel is the weakest channel in, when I say weakest, I don't know what that means exactly, but my special effects coordinator on house said that the blue channel is where you're most prone to get banding. Why that is, I've got no idea. It's why on a lot of digital cameras they recommend shooting green screen as opposed to blue screen because it's more responsive to green. And again, Steve might have the answer to that. I just do what I'm told. There's a good tip you can really help if you do run into banding, if you apply film grain, which we used to do all the time anyway because we were shooting on Kodak film stock and then using our 5Ds as supplementary cameras to shoot, like car interiors and inserts like I was talking about. We'd always add film grain to make it look more similar because you see film grain on film and you don't see film grain on digital. I mean, it sort of has a similar appearance, but if you add film grain, it can tend to make banding go away to a very large extent. And I think you can do that in
you can do it in really anything.
Yeah.
You can do it in Premiere, you can do it in Final Cut, just like, effects programs do it better, like, Nuke and all that stuff, and it just depends on what you work on, what your workflow is.
Right. And then, there was that whole thing, too, that the, some cameras are better than others with this ISO thing. I mean, Steve was saying 1250 is about as far as you should think about going, and even then it's sort of on the edge. The 1D, were you just going to come to that?
Well, that's the, I don't have the test for the 1D.
Right.
But the 1D, you can actually push it to about 3200 because it's got multiple processors in it. And then the way that it reads information, it reads it 3 times as fast as the 5D does. So it can get the information straight off the chip so it doesn't sit there. So, and the 1D Mark II, there's a couple cool things about it. I mean, you get a full 720 signal out of it. And like he said, the focus is really tricky. So when you're trying to focus on a Marshall monitor on a standard def connection, you're like, you can never really see if it's focused. You're like, I mean, some of the times when I'm like resort to shooting, I usually use the Zacuto Z Finder sometimes, and I'm just like, just because it's a higher resolution, or I'll turn the lens off and focus through the viewfinder, just because like then it's sharp. But like it becomes a nightmare focusing with the 5D sometimes, especially if you were shooting 1.2. You're just like, you're looking at the little dials and you're like, okay, we'll just do 3 feet to infinity and we'll call it that. But if you're shooting at 1.2, that's never going to happen. So you actually get a full 720 signal out of the Mark IV, and it actually helps drastically. It makes it so much sharper. It's a more durable camera. It's pretty much weather sealed to go to Africa in the flood season. It's a lot heavier. It costs a lot more, probably twice the amount. It's got 2 card slots in it, so you can carry double the memory. So, I mean, when you're on location, the battery lasts 2 or 3 times longer than a 5D battery. So, I mean, you got some advantages, but the disadvantage is it's 30% smaller, the chip size, than a 5D. So you get a 1.3 crop factor, which isn't so bad. I mean, you can deal with it by towing in and out. And, it's got a couple nifty, white balance shifts and all that stuff that actually has buttons on it you don't have to get into the menu. They're actually right there on the back of the camera instead of going through and doing all that stuff. So it's some of the things are a little bit more accessible, but I mean, all in all, it kind of just comes down to how much money you have and what you're looking to shoot. I mean, if you are going to Africa, yeah, I'd probably get one of those. But I mean, if you're kind of hanging out here, I would just kind of just get what you can afford. So I shoot with a 5D.
I've heard the 5D Mark III is going to be pretty awesome.
That's what we all hear. I mean, we're pretty tied to Canon, and like we haven't heard anything.
Yeah, they don't give anything away. I mean, there are so many people out there that say there's this coming out, and then 2 years later it finally arrives. And Canon are a company that is so fixed in terms of they'll announce a camera, and the next day it'll be on the shelf at Sammy's or B&H or wherever, and they never leak rumors or anything. They keep everything very tight to their. So whether there even will be a 5D Mark III is even a question. And I mean, because I haven't heard anything, and I know all the guys at Canon, and I was at NAB talking for them, and unless Vince knows.
Well, yeah, I think they are working on something, just because like a couple of the case manufacturers are working on a new Canon camera.
Yeah, they're all certainly working on stuff, because they were basically caught with their pants down when they came out with all this video capture stuff. They didn't realize that anybody would use it for filmmaking. They thought it was just going to be used to capture web stuff, and so suddenly they're saying, "You mean people are shooting with it? You mean they're actually making films with it?"
They actually they merged the two divisions.
Yeah.
The video and the DSLR, they're one now. Oh. So they kind of just started like working together. Yeah. So I mean, they're going to announce something probably in Photokina. So, but it might be the 1DS Mark IV, because they've needed a pro camera for so long. I mean, the 1DS Mark III is years old now, and it's just kind of so behind the curve. It doesn't even stand up to the 5D Mark II anymore. I mean, why would you buy a 1DS Mark IV or a Mark III when you could have a 5D for less than half of it, and it's a newer chip?
Yeah.
So if you needed the body, again, it's more of a durable weather seal body. So, but they'll probably announce something at Photokina. I don't know if it's going to be the big brother, the $8,000 one, or the Mark III, but you probably won't see the Mark III for the middle of like 2012. Mm-hmm. So, but again, like they tell us nothing. It could be tomorrow.
One of the things that has happened is several manufacturers have sort of started coming out with camcorders that have much bigger sensors, because they suddenly realized that, wow, and now they actually use the phrase shallow depth of field.
Yeah.
As a kind of, wow, they never even thought of it before. It's really, odd how that's changed, and it's all changed because of the HD DSLR revolution, basically. And
there's a couple of them that are really nice. I mean, the Panasonic AF100, it's about $5,000, which is slightly more than the 5D Mark II. I mean, it's pretty decent. But then Sony just came out with their new F3, and that thing's beautiful. It's amazing, but it's $16,000, and then the firmware upgrade's another $3,000.
And then by the time you add the lenses,
and then they take PL mount lenses, so we're up to the 10,000, and then all the Firestore cards recording 444 uncompressed, which you need a terabyte Firestore to do it. Yeah, you might as well be shooting a full production at that time. So.
Yeah, but on the other hand, what's interesting about it is the F3, for example, compares to
the F35.
The F35, which cost, a fortune.
Yeah. It's a broadcast. They shoot TV shows with it.
Yeah. So things are changing in a really radical way, and so basically the cost of cameras that can capture high enough quality really to put on the big screen are kind of just around the corner. When we when we did the season finale of House, and we were invited to go and talk about it at the DGA, the Directors Guild of America, Greg Yatanis, the director, and myself, I was absolutely petrified because they put us in Theatre 1, which has got a 70-foot screen, and they projected several sequences, and I was actually blown away at the quality, and I wouldn't have any qualms whatsoever to shoot certain types of movie on a 5D or a 7D or a 1D Mark IV. I think to go and shoot a landscape picture like Dances with Wolves would be committing suicide, because you can't expect it to have the definition that makes those beautiful big wide panoramic shots kind of stand up. But if you're making a drama or a comedy and you want to make it on a low budget, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do it now. And that website I mentioned, the Third Reel, you'll see some amazing stuff on there that's shot on 5Ds that's it's beautiful, and but it requires a certain amount of cleverness in terms of the kinds of shots you work with, how you compose them, but it is there, and there are limitations. It's just a matter of avoiding the pitfalls that make this all possible. It is changing enormously, and we're just seeing the beginnings of this. But I mean, what is so great is that anybody that really wants to make a film really doesn't have an excuse anymore. It's all there, it really is. And that's it.
Yeah. I think it's gear now.
Yeah, I think we should take a break. I think, actually, I'm sure there's, somebody must have a question.
One or two people, I think, have a question.
Yeah, around the world.
I don't know if we're going to get into shutter speed later, but Ken and I are both kind of learning to do filmmaking,
Okay.
and on the 5D. And one of the previous students from one of our previous workshops had taught us that we should always be shooting at 1/50th,
Yeah.
because that's closest to the 24 frames per second.
It's closest to the 48th of a
48th,
second, and
sorry.
that's what
See, I'm
the
still
cinema
learning.
shoots.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Can you talk to that?
I think it gives you the most cinematic kind of look because, so much of what we expect to see when you see a movie and things is the way in which we've been brought up, and most of us here have been brought up going to the movies and, seeing movies on TV and things like that. And the amount of motion blur is really what it's all about, and it was just because, they had butterfly shutters on movie cameras, so while the shutter was across the lens, covering the lens up, was when the film was advanced to the next frame, and that was exactly, if you were shooting normally, it was a 180-degree shutter, so therefore 24 frames, half the time was, that would be your shutter speed, so that would be a 48th of a second. So it's the amount of motion blur you get by doing that is something that we're very used to seeing and what we've been brought up to see. It's really funny because in Japan they shoot everything at 30 frames because they like that look. To me it looks more electronic. It's certainly sharper because the frames are going faster, so you have less motion blur on the frames, but it's just the Japanese taste. They prefer to shoot at 30 frames, and we don't, because we're being brought up in North America or in Europe where 24 or 25 frames on TV in Europe is more the norm. And, it's to do with those sorts of preconceptions you have from what we're used to looking at. It's interesting though, because I've heard of quite a few DPs that shoot on things like a 30th of a second. But to me, all that would do would be to give you a little bit more light if you needed it. It would give you certainly more motion blur.
Sometimes you have to switch the shutter too, because if you're shooting under fluorescence and you don't have a cinema
Correct,
studio, the frequency, you'll get those black bars. So if you go down to a 30th or up to a 60th, it'll eliminate that frequency.
Yeah, because then you become in sync with the 60th of a second cycles of, the
You don't
fluorescence.
always have to keep it at 1/50th. It's not something you just set it to and keep it there.
No, I mean, as Stephen was saying, if you were forced to shoot in a supermarket, say, and you notice these sort of very broad, sort of darkish bands that move up the image, that's when you would be obliged to change to either shooting at a 30th of a second or a 60th to eliminate that. And the difference between a 50th and a 60th is pretty negligible, so probably most people wouldn't notice. So there are times when you'd want to change it, but it would actually be interesting to see if any viewers out there have any comments on that, because there's only so much that I've tested, and I know some people shoot on a 30th and on other shutter speeds, and there might be valid reasons for it that I don't know about.
Hey, Steven.
Yep.
Do you guys shoot on the stock firmware, or have you used like hacked or alternative firmwares like Magic Lantern to get like zebras and monitors and stuff?
Because we're authorized by Canon, like we're not really allowed to, because when you open up the firmware of the camera and you put aftermarket in it, it voids the warranty immediately. So, and I've seen a couple of those go down to where they overheat, and they're not, I don't know, I've played with them, but they're just not fluent enough. Like they're really glitchy and they just don't work as well. And we have the monitors.
Gotcha.
So like it's just really easy to shoot on the monitors. But dude, the Magic Lantern does work pretty cool. Like I do like the in-camera peaking and like the zebra and all that stuff and the false color. But it's not quite as consistent as it needs to be yet. But it's also free.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it'd be cool if they tried to work with Canon to like kind of promote it and like actually put it into it. But like, I think we'll start seeing at like the least, we'll see features like that in the camera.
In the next cameras coming out, yeah.
Just because like, I mean, with like zebra and like all the highlight and all that stuff, like those are like huge things. So especially hopefully we'll get a full res signal, but if we don't, at least peaking in camera. But yeah, we don't really use the Magic Lantern stuff just because
We're sponsored by Canon, and they'd get
Canon
mad
said
if we
no.
melted all their cameras. Yeah.
There's a couple guys that came in though. It looks really cool.
Yeah.
It's got a whole different menu. It just doesn't work as fluid as like you would want it to, like because the Canon's just so responsive. But sometimes it'll stick on some stuff, and you're like,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I've heard it's buggy as well.
Right.
Yeah. I would never do that.
So we have lots of questions. I have a question from Jordan Thompson, as well as a lot of people have asked this. How do you address the moire pattern problems using the 5D and such?
I tend to avoid it before it begins, which is obviously in wardrobe, make the right wardrobe choices. I don't particularly think that the HD DSLRs do moire much worse than any camcorders in the past. I mean, cameras such as the HVX200, so I think it's a matter of doing tests as much as you can. I believe in testing as much as possible. I mean, for example, on house, I test as much as I can every piece of wardrobe that's likely to appear in front of the camera. Sometimes we don't have a chance, but it's not a big issue. I mean, things like rolling shutter is a much bigger issue than moire.
That's what I was gonna say.
Did that person, if they want to come back later and explain why they're having so many moire patterns, maybe?
Somebody had mentioned about brick, asked about moire on brick specifically.
Just a brick wall or people in front of a brick wall, like. Because I mean, if you're shooting like a pattern, I mean, you're gonna get some crazy banding and moire and like all that stuff.
I mean, I suppose a huge brick wall at a distance has that potential.
But if it's just a brick wall, you can just blur it out a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you'll get rid of it.
Yeah, if it's just slightly out of focus, it'll go away. In other words, then maybe the solution might have been to have used an ND filter and, sort of open up the aperture and make sure that's slightly soft, because then it would go away. Because when we have had moire in on house, and it happens occasionally, you get it on, the grill of a car that's just slightly twisted, and you've got all those chrome stripes. It's just a matter of defocus. We put a window on it and just slightly defocus it in post, and it goes away.
Windows for everything.
Yeah.
Fix it in post.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the cost of television production time, as I mentioned, is kind of like so huge. I do half my work as a DP in post because it's much more efficient for me to spend 5 minutes with a color timer and do a couple of things than it is to make 200 people wait for 5 minutes while I set some flags to control a bright wall that's distracting, or something like that, whereas it's just a sort of 5 minute job in post. It's, economics. And I think a lot of TV DPs work like that, so often there are things in what we call dailies when I see what we shot the previous day that disappoint me, but I know that I can get hold of it and rectify it later, and it's much more efficient. It's like a stills photographer just knowing, well, I can take that image and I can do some amazing thing with that in Photoshop. As long as you have the vision to know what you can do, that's fine. And it's often a better way of doing it than, maybe waiting for 3 hours for the light to come round the corner of a mountain just to give you a bit more illumination. It might actually do something that you didn't want it to do instead. It might be just better to do that in post, because the vision's a combination of what's in your head and what's actually in front of you,
Yeah.
Gil, can we just talk, Just Chucks in the chat had asked if you can just speak a little bit more to the problem of the rolling shutter with DSLRs.
It can be nasty. I'm personally trying to talk myself into liking it. It's funny though, you can take a lot of things and things that on the face of it appear to be disadvantageous or ugly and actually make use of them. One thing I'm dying to try and do is to do a shot where I move the camera like crazy on a person's face and then try and stabilize the frame later, because what that would do would be to distort their face, and it could be fantastic in a nightmare scene. So that would be an example of taking something that's effectively a fault with the camera or a problem with the camera and turning it to good effect. And I think it's interesting. I think it's good to avoid aimless panning shots. That's the first thing, that don't either go with something. If you, just sort of panning across bare space, you're inviting trouble. And so you tend to avoid those kinds of shots. And if you want to move from one actor to another, use the movement of another actor to take you there, or set up your scenario so that the camera could track around and hold one actor to bring the other actor into frame, rather than just doing a straight pan. Because straight pans across what I call no man's land are boring shots anyway. So, I love things like sliders and little tracks and things like that, so you can move from one actor past him to reveal another, or be on an actor and come back and include an actor to find him. And so just think about your transitions differently. Again, it's a weakness, but in fact, every single digital motion capture device has a rolling shutter problem to a certain extent, and even on the Alexa, it's there. It's not as severe as on the 5D, obviously. The 5D is a $2,500 camera, so that's all I could say is work out your transitions that avoid panning. Sometimes you can't. I mean, if you've got a shot on somebody at a railway station and a train's coming in behind them, the windows are at 45 degrees.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty cool train with 45-degree windows as far as I'm concerned. And if anyone's noticing that, then you've lost them in the story. Just get closer or, avoid it, keep it out of focus. I mean, make it less important,
So note to self, no panning B-roll shots.
Yeah, it's better. You can work around it. When we did the season finale, we just tended to work around all those problems, and it wasn't really an issue. I mean, it didn't hurt the story. There's so many ways to skin a cat,